There is a certain kind of silence that feels louder than words, the kind that comes after a message is seen, understood, and still left unanswered. Not because it wasn't received, not because it wasn't noticed, but because, for reasons unseen, it was simply ignored. And that silence creates a storm in the mind. You start questioning what changed in seconds. You replay your words. You analyze the timing. You wonder if you said too much or maybe not enough. But here is the truth most people never want to accept. Silence is not empty. It is communication without explanation. When someone sees your message and chooses not to reply, they are revealing something far deeper than words ever could. It is not always about confusion or being busy. Sometimes it is about priority. Sometimes it is about emotional distance. And sometimes it is about control, choosing when and how to respond to maintain power in the dynamic. But what hurts most is not the lack of response. It is the uncertainty it creates. Because the mind hates unanswered questions, it fills silence with assumptions, fears, and hope all at once. And that is where the real truth lies, not in what was said, but in what was intentionally left unsaid. Because when attention is available but not given, it tells you everything you need to know about where you stand in someone's mental and emotional space, even when no words are spoken at all. Expand the keynote 1. Don't add heading and speaker name up to 300 words. When a message is seen but not answered, the mind doesn't process it as a simple delay. It processes it as a signal. And that signal immediately triggers curiosity, doubt, and emotional overthinking. Because silence after acknowledgement feels different than silence before awareness. It feels intentional, even when you are not sure it is. At first, there is resistance to accept it. You try to rationalize it in the most comforting ways possible. Maybe the phone is busy. Maybe the timing is wrong. Maybe there's just no time right now. These thoughts act like emotional protection, soft cushions against a harder truth. But as time passes and no response comes, those explanations slowly lose strength. Then the mind shifts into analysis mode. You start rereading the message, not for what was said, but for what might have been wrong with it. The tone, the timing, the choice of words, all of it becomes under a microscope, not because it truly matters, but because uncertainty demands answers, and the brain will search anywhere to find them. But the deeper psychology behind silence is not always about the message itself. It is about attention and value. People respond quickly to what they prioritize, and they delay or avoid what they don't. This is where emotional reality quietly reveals itself, not in grand statements, but in response time, effort, and consistency. And what makes this even more powerful is that silence after being seen removes the excuse of ignorance. The message was acknowledged, it was read, it entered awareness, and still no action followed. That gap between awareness and response is where truth often hides, unspoken but very clear. As time continues without a reply, something subtle begins to shift inside you. It is no longer just about a message anymore. It becomes about meaning. The silence stops being a single moment and starts turning into a pattern in your mind. You begin to interpret it not as an action, but as a message in itself. What makes this type of silence so powerful is that it forces emotional projection. Because there is no explanation, the mind creates one. And often, the stories it creates are shaped by fear, attachment, or past experiences. You may start wondering if interest has faded, if space is being created, or if you are being slowly pushed away without confrontation. But psychologically, silence is often used as a form of emotional distance, not always with intention to hurt, but sometimes to create space, avoid responsibility, or reduce emotional engagement. When someone does not want to fully invest in a connection, Responding becomes effortful, and when effort is low, silence becomes easier than conversation. There is also another layer that many people overlook: control. Delayed responses can sometimes shift emotional balance. When one person waits and overthinks while the other remains unavailable, it creates an imbalance of emotional energy. The one waiting becomes more emotionally invested, while the one silent holds more control over timing and attention. However, the most important truth hidden inside silence is not about them. It is about you. How long you stay in uncertainty reveals how much power you are giving to unanswered questions. Because the longer you wait for clarity from someone unwilling to give it, the more you begin to disconnect from your own emotional stability. Silence does not just show disinterest or distance, it exposes where emotional energy flows and who is actively choosing to participate in that flow and who is not. At a certain point, silence stops being something you are waiting to end and starts becoming something you are trying to understand. You no longer check your phone just out of hope. You check it out of habit, as if repetition might eventually change the outcome. And this is where emotional attachment quietly deepens without you realizing it. Because when someone becomes inconsistent, your attention becomes consistent. That imbalance slowly reshapes your emotional focus. You begin to invest more energy into decoding absence than you ever invested into the actual conversation itself. And that shift is powerful because it moves your emotional center outside of your control. What most people don't realize is that silence often doesn't require explanation to be understood. It reveals itself through behavior patterns. Someone who values connection will usually make space for communication, even in small ways. But when communication becomes selective, delayed, or avoidant, it creates a pattern of emotional distance that speaks louder than any excuse. And yet, the mind resists accepting that pattern. It prefers possibility over conclusion. Because possibility keeps hope alive. It allows room for maybe later, maybe they're busy, or maybe things will change. But conclusion forces acceptance, and acceptance requires letting go of uncertainty. This is why silence can feel so consuming. It keeps you suspended between truth and hope. You are not fully moving forward, but you are not fully letting go either. You exist in the middle space where emotional energy is constantly being spent but never returned. And in that space, the real danger is not rejection, it is attachment to inconsistency, because inconsistency trains the mind to wait for moments of attention instead of recognizing patterns of absence. And over time, what was once confusing begins to feel normal, even when it is quietly draining you. In the end, silence after being seen is never just about a missing reply. It is about the message that absence delivers without words. It reveals priorities, emotional availability, and the level of effort someone is willing to give when no pressure is applied. But the deeper truth is not only about the other person's behavior, it is about your awareness. Because once you understand that consistency speaks louder than potential and actions matter more than assumptions, silence starts losing its power over your emotions. What once felt confusing begins to feel clear. What once created anxiety begins to look like information. And what once kept you waiting slowly turns into clarity that allows you to move differently. The real shift happens when you stop chasing meaning in silence and start observing patterns in behavior. Because when someone wants to communicate, they find a way. And when they consistently don't, that itself becomes the answer. And at that point, silence is no longer something that needs to be decoded. It becomes something that quietly guides you toward understanding where you truly stand and where you no longer need to stay.